wishing I could take a break from this world. Running on a hamster wheel, but searching for something I can't feel. I just wanna be a lost girl and fly. Take a breath, feel my wings spread, levitate above the ground and make eye contact with clouds. Now I'm rising, I'm soaring above it all. I just wanna be free. Finally, I 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 always stay dreaming, never imagined I lose my spark. Living in this crazy time, putting back the pieces of my mind. I know how to run from the dark and fly. Take a breath, feel my wings spread, levitate into the clouds. I'm so high above the ground. I'm rising, I'm soaring above it all. I just wanna be free. Finally, I wanna be free.
Race, conversations, and law enforcement. This is Moses' People Speak.
Well. Welcome back to Moses People Speak. I'm your host, Terry Watson. And for those who've been keeping track, it's been over a year since we last convened. So again, my name is Terry Watson. I'm the host of Moses People Speak and the founder of Strategies for Justice. So quickly, before we have our guest on, I want to do a quick couple shout outs. And because again, we've been going for a year, I won't cover a whole year of things, but I do want to talk about some of the things that is happening. So first, I want to shout out to my brother, Lieutenant Edwin Raymond from the NYPD. His book will be coming out I believe October 17th of this year. The book is called An Inconvenient Cop, My Fight to Change Policing in America. So definitely cop that book. I know a program will also be happening in New York City on August, way past August 21st. No, sorry, October 14th. The actual tickets went on sale on August 21st, but the program is happening October 14th. So then cop the book, definitely check out the program, and we look forward to hopefully having Edwin Raymond on the show as well. Next, I want to talk about the NABLEO conference. The NABLEO conference, the theme is balancing accountability, social justice, and public safety. It's going to be in Norwood, Massachusetts from October 4th to October 6th. If you can make it, that would be great, especially if we could get more citizens to attend. By all means, this is a conference that SFJ has been a sponsor for the past 2 years, and definitely will be a sponsor again this year. So if you can, definitely check out that conference. I want to say congratulations to our brother Damon K. Jones. He retired after 33 years in law enforcement. So hopefully he is watching. Much flowers going out to him right now. Hopefully he is having fun in his retirement. And one day we got to get him back on the show too. For those who don't know, Damon K. Jones was the first guest on Moses People Speak. So we might want to get him back on here after he now retired. Still obviously doing his good work in the community, but congratulations, my brother Damon K. Jones, on your retirement. So last but not least, those who don't know, because it's been a whole year, I did drop the book. I've been talking about the book for a while, and the book finally came out in 2022. So November, I'm doing a lot of traveling. State College, I'll be part of a program on the 5th, on the 14th of November. Catch me in Louisville, Kentucky on November 10th and 11th. And if you are in Phoenix, Arizona, I'll be there on the 15th, 16th, and also on the 17th. 2 different programs. So with that said, let's get started with our guest. I'm so excited. So I met this brother, David, actually at a conference. And I was actually at a conference in Vegas. And I said to David after this conference, hey man, we got to talk, because some of the things that he was talking about sort of caught my attention. And not just that, some of the stories that he was sharing. So we met up a couple of times, and I said we got to get you on Moses People Speak. So I wanted to get ahead and bring David on stage. David, welcome to Moses People Speak. I am glad that you are with us today.
Couldn't be happier to be here, Terry. That was the conference seems like it was a million years ago, but I guess it wasn't. It was only a few months. But
It was.
Yeah, but a lot's happened since then. No, it was a pleasure, and I'm really, really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. And it was I was actually thinking about this too. The actual section that the conference session that we was attending was presenting by some ladies who was talking about white supremacy in education. I think that was the topic of the actual session itself, but also some of the ways they were trying to identify what that looks like and definitely how to address it. So before we get started in this great conversation, David, I guess I didn't go over your bio. Those who are watching probably read the bio already, but definitely tell us about yourself. What did you do, and just in general, yeah.
Yeah. Currently, I'm the associate dean of the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences at the University of New Haven in Connecticut. My background is. It's not really all over the place, but there's just a couple of avenues I walked down. My first career was as a private investigator and a defense investigator back in California, where I was raised. And I did my Ph.D. examining sort of the investigative process as it relates to forensic science. And that kind of spun me off into an interesting direction when I realized that that science is great. We need it. Don't think otherwise. But really what we need to do is start changing the minds of the people that are investigating. And that led me to an experience with the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Museum of Tolerance in New York, where I spent some time training police specifically on curricula related to community policing and racial profiling. And just kind of spiraled would be the best way I could describe it from there.
Right.
And so now we're up here at the Lee College taking the benefits of not only my experiences, but many others who are on faculty up here in developing classes and curriculum that sort of specifically deal more directly with some of the issues surrounding police decision making around groups that don't traditionally find themselves treated well by police, and what that means for education. And I think right now we're seeing again the conversation around how valuable education is in public service. And I'm finding that, where you're seeing problems, you tend to see an absence of education, and where you're seeing progression, you tend to see a lot of education. And so we're just very much leaning into this.
And it was interesting that you mentioned the education piece, because one of the things that we've been talking about in SFJ specifically is the importance of that cross-cultural education in policing. And there are some states where that kind of education is being attacked right now, and why that's so important. David, if you don't mind, because I wish I could say that I knew this before bringing you on the show, because I probably would have dug more into this in the description, but you started your investigation career on an interesting case. Can you share to us what that experience was like?
Yeah. I didn't start my career there, but I happened upon it. Would be the safest way to say it. I was very young, and I was working in a private investigations company in Orange County, California. My boss, a man named David Sandberg, and we at some point in the process of working in that office, we inherited the Rodney King investigation against the city of Los Angeles. We were working with the attorney Milton Grimes, And at that time, I was very young, and it was a very it was a surprise. Nobody really predicted that this was going to come our way. And when it did, we were ready to jump on it, so to speak. But to say, to be at that age and to be thrust into a case that was on the front page of every paper, it was on the news every night, it was on. It was a master's, a PhD, all rolled into. I mean, it was one of the greatest educational sort of processes or moments of my life, in just not only understanding investigative function, but what happens to investigative function at that kind of line, or under that kind of microscope, under that kind of limelight. And so, it was a way of sort of, cutting your teeth on a really tough, sort of trial by fire experience. But myself and the other investigators I was working with in the office, I think we did a bang up job, and I think we were all very young, and we were all very, dedicated to what we did. And I think the result was very, very positive for Rodney and for us. But I think back of it now, it just seems so long ago, Terry. I mean, it is. It's 30 years, and that's just such a long time, But and so having that on a resume opened some doors down the line, right? That was very true.
Yeah, and when we think about the Rodney King case, because and as we were saying this before we got on air, that was really the first case in which video evidence played a role in police brutality or police misconduct, right? And there's been cases in the past in which police misconduct was the conversation or part of the case, but Rodney King, that one was the first that was actually caught on video, and really it did impact, I think, really the way that folks looked at criminal justice from that point of view. So let me ask you, what is, as we're talking about cross-cultural differences in policing, I know that again, you and I had some plenty of time to talk about this too, but why is that so important? I mean, what is the most important pieces about, why cross-cultural training needs to happen? I'll let you open that up.
Yeah, sure. It's one of those areas where I feel like we spend a tremendous amount of language saying something that's very simple. And sometimes I'm amazed at how many words people use to just describe the idea that to be in public service, it is required for you to deal with people who are not like you. It's not rocket science. And if you've never gone through a process where you've self-examined on not only what do you think about people who are not like you, but most importantly, why do you think that way? And does that serve you? If those questions have never been asked, I would find that to be a defunct education for someone who's going to be in public service. You don't have tools that you need. And one of the things that I find so fascinating is somehow that today has spun into a political conversation, or it's spun into you're this type of person or that type of person. And yet, when I am involved in conversations with police chiefs, and I'm involved in the curriculum that we've developed here, to assist with this education, I get people from all over the political spectrum, the social spectrum, the economic spectrum. Not one of them disagrees with the base concept that we've got to challenge people to understand why they react the way they do when people are not like themselves, and to not bring that to those that are seeking an education to serve in public service. To me, that's that just strikes me as weird, and it's really it's not easy to do. I'm not trying to say it's simple in the sense that it's easy to do, but I am saying that the concept seems relatively simple. If you're going to be out there in a country like America dealing with as many different types of people as we have to deal with, to not have trained yourself to operate in that kind of environment where you can, flux and change and move with what you're experiencing, knowing what your reactions are because you've self-examined, you're not going to be as effective as someone who does. And that's ultimately where I think the basis of a lot of what we're talking about. And I think that was the comment that I threw out in that little conversation at the conference that caught that woman's attention, because she really wanted me to speak further about that. And I remember thinking, is this really all that advanced? It seems rather simple to me. And so anyway, that's sort of been the impetus for a lot of the work that we've been doing in developing curriculum up here.
Let me ask you, have you received any pushback? Because I know when we talk about, cross-cultural training, right now, diversity, DEIB is under attack tremendously, right? Have you received any pushback, and what do you think? Why is it that some departments, maybe not all departments, but some departments may say, I don't want to undergo this training, or they don't see it as a need?
I mean, there's 18,600, whatever it is, police departments in this country. Each one of them has a chief that has reasons for doing anything that they do. And it's difficult to know what anybody's thinking, when you look at some of the policies that are made and how they're made and whatever. There are a lot of police, chiefs that I've met up here. Again, Connecticut is an interesting place. There's a lot of police departments up here for such a small state. But, I meet a lot of people up here who, again, as I said, they come from lots of different backgrounds, but everyone seems to be in agreement with this, at least with this idea. How you orchestrate this idea, separate conversation, but the base concept is the same. So the pushback that I receive generally comes from misunderstanding what I'm saying. And so a lot of it is, it just requires some clarification. Would there be others in different states that might take a position where they're not misunderstanding what I'm saying at all, but they still think it's a bad idea? Sure. We've seen enough come out of certain areas in this country where I don't know how they expect to train police officers to do the job that they need to do if they're not going to provide them with access to the ability to speak to people who are not like them, and to simply default to the idea that they're good people, therefore they can figure it out. Well, if that were the case, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation.
Right.
So, I mean, clearly something needs to be done differently. And so usually it's not pushback on the concept. It's just explaining it to such a degree that people begin to really understand what we're doing. I mean, because to be honest with you, Terry, I wouldn't actually call what we're doing up here DEIAB per se. It's self-reflection. And I find it impossible to go through a self-reflexive process and not become more open-minded. So in that sense, the goal is still achieved. But I think if someone were to say, are you teaching about different cultures? Actually, no. What I'm teaching is I'm asking students to tell me how they feel about cultures that they don't know much about, and where did those feelings come from? And then we're processing that, in a directed curriculum for the purposes of getting them to see that, and then to understand why that might be dysfunctional for them.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of our dear friends of this organization, Shannon. She does a workshop called Interrogating Bias, and pretty much the same thing is where is this coming from, right? And it's sort of exploring, again, I specifically talk a lot about racism and ableism. Those are my two topics I like to go back and forth on, right? But again, there is no ism that stands out above other isms. It's usually the idea of how do you interrogate oneself to ask the question, where is this coming from? But you did say something, David, I want to jump on it, is the how. How do we do that? Because that self-reflection is, again, it's one of those things that people say a lot, but yeah.
Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? Right. Yeah, it's not easy. We have, by any stretch, and I'm not trying to say that to be to state the obvious. It is a struggle, and it's a struggle that we deal with, on an ongoing basis. The first thing you do is you find something to discuss with students that allows them to talk about themselves in a way where they're not afraid. And that's hard, but we found a vehicle that seems to be working really well for us. And what we found is the conversation you're having with them is first training them in a way to get them to understand the difference between things about people that are decided and things about people that are not. You and I have, things about us that we had nothing to do with. We did not choose. I'm willing to bet that both of us have haircuts we wish we did not have, right? We wish we could change. We wish we could choose, right? And so one of the first steps is to start there as a basis, because that allows students to talk about themselves and maybe some things about themselves that have been judged unfairly, that make it a more common experience. And again, let me be clear, like I said, that's a starting place. That's a place where we begin a conversation. And by doing that, we've been amazed in teaching this curriculum in how students will talk about themselves and talk about how they've processed other people's things about them that they didn't decide, other things about people that they didn't decide, in sometimes very negative ways, simply because of social programming, or because of the environment they were in, or because of the group that they hung out with, or whatever. And so that conversation, that's day one, and that gets them sort of in a position where they can actually, again, start asking themselves, well, am I judging this thing about you that you didn't decide, even if it's not, race or religion or sexuality or gender? Maybe it's the fact that your parents come from a particular place, or, or it's your socioeconomic status, or one instance we had, not strangely enough, again, back to law enforcement, one young woman was talking about how she didn't choose her father to be a police chief, but yet she has to deal with that when people project, concepts on her because she comes from a family of law enforcement. And all of it relates to a concept that allows us to see how we are processing this application of judgment onto things about others that they didn't decide. And once you start there, then you can get into some pretty great stuff, as long as you've created an environment where everybody feels safe.
Talking about creating an environment, one of the things that we've talked about in an extensive way is the work that you're doing in Europe with the students, right? I think, and I do want you to talk about that a little bit too, because when we talk about, most people speak, we are typically focused on what's happening in America, except for the very last episode, which was Rockin' and Boat, which was from the UK, right? That was the first time I think we talked about policing outside of America. But what you're doing in Europe, I also find that very fascinating, because there are some things I think we could bring back to the U.S. And so, if you don't mind, David, sharing about the experience that you've had with the work you're doing in Europe, and I think I even put that in the description too.
Yeah. There are some experiences, some historical experiences that are out there that I think lend themselves so beautifully to law enforcement training, that for us not to take advantage of them simply because they didn't happen here is a little silly, or we're leaving a lot on the table.
Right.
And one of those things, quite frankly, is the Holocaust, and what happened with the rise of National Socialism, and what happened in many countries throughout Europe during World War II. And the reason why I think this is the case is because law enforcement in so many countries played a role. And in some instances, that role was abominable and horrible, and we shudder at it. But in many cases, no, there were amazing, acts of bravery on behalf of law enforcement, in protecting people and rights and property and all kinds of things. And it's important, I think, for whenever you have an extreme example, that's sometimes when the lessons can shine most brightly, right? Because it is so extreme, it becomes clear for us to see how the decision making of any one particular person worked in that environment, because the example is so extreme. But thankfully, the university up here, the University of New Haven, we have a very special and very tight relationship with the Polish National Police. And so when every summer COVID and the Ukraine invasion kind of put the kibosh on this for a few years, but we restarted it this summer. we have a study abroad that is hosted by the Polish National Police. And so I take a group of students and we go to a nation where we are taken completely behind the scenes. We see everything. They show us, from the top down. We met with their leaders, we met with their top people, all the way down to getting very candid conversations with, line serving officers. And, it's a very different type of policing. It's one police force for an entire nation of 32, 35 million, whatever it is, million people. And that's a completely different way of looking at policing than we do here in the States. But it allows the students to, not only do we go to Auschwitz and we have conversations specifically related to what happened in Poland because of the Nazis and National Socialism, but we also get to see a police force that grew from that after surviving, 50, 60 years of Soviet rule as well. But the other piece of it, not quite that long, 30 years, but the other piece of it that is important is how much of what is going on in that country that they're still living with. And that was a very big thing for the students. The students were really kind of blown away at how this isn't something that happened yesterday. This is still happening. And one of the things that really moved them is we went to a facility, and I wish I could remember the name, but I can't get my Polish is horrible. I've been to Poland, I don't know how many times at this point, but my Polish is still horrible. And so I apologize to all the Polish people out there. I love your language. I just can't get there. But this prison, it's a pretrial facility. So it would be like our county jail. And the building was first used by the Poles. Then it was taken over by the Nazis and used as a place of torture and murder. Then it was taken over by the Russians and used for a similar fashion. And now it's taken over again by the Poles, who are using it again as a pretrial facility. And yet when you walk in the facility, on the walls, they have all these posters about all of the learning events and the books that have been written and all these things about the history of the place, so that as people work there, they're walking through an environment where they're being shown, this is the horror that happened here, don't let it happen again. And it, like, you can imagine what that would do to your average corrections officer in terms of knowing what took place in this space and taking, and again, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but responsibility. Right? It's not about blame. It's about taking responsibility. And to have that kind of responsibility there that you're in, right? You're working in it every day. The students were just floored. And, you and I have talked about this, Terry, as we have another mutual friend we have, why we haven't embraced that here in this country in a similar format. We could look at our history. We could get police officers, from different points of view, and we could place them in environments where we could have these conversations. And that happened actually in 2016 when I was there. There was an amazing training put together by the Auschwitz Jewish Center, and the conference was called DEMPOL, and it involved cops from Germany and cops from Poland coming together and talking about the Holocaust as a tool for dealing with the rise of hate crime in Europe that was happening, and it was happening then, still happening now. And that was a fascinating experience to witness. But what I also saw was how much self-reflection and growth that the individual officers went through, because there wasn't a Polish police officer that participated that didn't have a relative that was killed in the Holocaust. And yet the German police, they were great. Everybody got along, it was wonderful, but they were not really knowing too much about or they weren't forthcoming with information about, their families and the Nazis and whether they were involved. And the only word I can think of, it was cathartic at a level that was life-changing. And myself and the other professor that was there with me, Tim Palmbach, he and I were Schindler professors. We have an Oscar Schindler professorship here at the university. I was the prior, he was the incoming Schindler. So we went on this adventure together for that purpose. And both of us were just, completely floored. He was an ex-state police officer for many years, and I had my background, but the two of us were just, it was the most incredible experience to watch these officers go through this. And,
Wow.
and when I came back, I thought, we are robbing ourselves of a potential here by not taking advantage of it, and again, there's a lot in our history that we can use in a very same way that the Germans and the Poles have found, by using the Holocaust. It was just, it was life-changing, absolutely life-changing.
Yeah, and again, I agree. I think about the the history with policing in America, starting with slave patrols and going to where we are now. And I do think that there's a conversation that's been avoided that really, like you said, doesn't do the training justice if we're not having those conversations. One thing you shared with me too, and David, I don't know how much you want to be vulnerable today, but there was a story that you shared with me that I mean, you just met me like 2 hours, right? And you shared a story with me, and I remember walking away thinking, "Holy crap!" If we get well, no, I as you know, I'm a collector of narratives. I'm a collector of narratives, and you shared your own self-reflection, your own internal journey. And I always, again, I the book that I wrote last year, and I always the whole question behind the book is, as a Black conscious man, how have I contributed to white supremacy? And when I'm presenting, like I was in Vegas, I always challenge folks. I say, if that's a journey that I'm able to take, I don't see why, as a white brother or sister, you're not able to take that journey too. But I didn't even share that with you, but you did share something with me, and I just thought that was really impactful. So again, not putting you on the spot, but I thought that was just to give people an example of what self-reflection looks like.
Yeah. No, I'm happy to talk about it, just because it is history, and it's facts are facts, and the more we run from them, the harder it is for us to process them in ways that make sense, for the future.
Right.
No, what I discovered about the time I was in the midst of my work with the Wiesenthal Center, as my grandfather passed away. This is on my mother's side of the family. And through some connections, I received some information that made it pretty clear that my grandfather's grandfather, so I guess it would be my great-great-grandfather, and it was highly likely that he was a Klan member. And because of what he did for a living and his connective tissue with the community that he lived in at the time, which was down in Georgia, that it was highly likely that he wasn't an inconsequential Klan member. In other words, it was likely that he was probably somebody who called some shots and was involved in, whatever, I don't know. But when I found that out, it really hit me hard. And the reason I think it hit me so hard was because it all of a sudden, a lot of what history had laid before me in terms of books and learning and movies, and I'm a bit of a history dork anyway, so I do read this stuff, and I'm very interested in it. And all of a sudden, it was like I wasn't telescoping anymore. It's like no, the family were there, right? And it's not me, right? It's not blame, right. But I need to have a conversation with myself about taking responsibility, and that was really sort of eye-opening. And what little I heard from the rest of my family on that side about their reactions to this was odd. I remember thinking that this should have been much more significant. But okay, but I'm going to be on I'm going to be on my journey, so I'm going to do my thing.
Right.
And so that helped me look, keep thinking and keep looking and thinking about, well, you talk about generational pain or generational trauma and how are things passed down. And, fast forward to, January 6th, the insurrection. And this happens. And, I'm watching the news like everybody else, and I'm horrified like everybody else. And I'm just like, this is insane. I can't believe this is happening. And I get a text from a family member, and it's a picture of my brother, who is standing in the midst of it all down in DC, and he wasn't charged with anything. He wasn't so close that he wasn't that close, but he did get interviewed by the FBI. I mean, he was close enough to he got caught in whatever information that they were running, and he got interviewed. And that nobody can tell me that these two things aren't connected. It's just, I'm sorry, I can't. I mean, in my self-examination, looking at my, listening, thinking about my grandfather, thinking about the past, thinking about my family, I mean, this, to not acknowledge that we are still living in a legacy that has been handed down through, various, particular points of generational trauma. I would love I'd love to see more research. I want more research done. And of course, mine's only one story, but there it is. But that really was significant for me. It really, really was significant for me to see that and go, wow, okay, I am on the right path. I am doing, this is what I should be doing. And very much in taking responsibility for myself, with this knowledge. And so that was, it was a fascinating piece. It really was. And it's not something I took lightly, and I still don't. And I was open with you about it simply, for the same reason that I'm open with anybody about it, is because talking about and talking through it is part of what fuels that process. If you want to fix it, I can't go back in time, but what I can do is I can, make the world that around me aware of the fact that I've done this work. And, maybe if you haven't looked, maybe you should too. I mean, there's a lot of families that have, that have benefited from the legacy of slavery. And there's a lot of people that have, a lot of privilege and base because of what happened, during that time. And to act like, because nobody handed me a paycheck, that means that I'm off the hook. That doesn't strike me as a very adult attitude. It also seems devoid of all self-reflection. And it doesn't mean that you get to be blamed for something. It doesn't mean that you have to, no one's going to, hold you responsible for what my great-great-grandfather did. But I can certainly see from how my family is still doing what they're doing that that there's energy there that needs to be combated. And maybe that's how I'm going to take responsibility. So.
And that's important because, I think a lot of times when I'm talking about, racism or the generational trauma, I always talk about, when we're reflecting, asking those internal questions, it's not about passing blame, or it's not about saying, because your ancestors did this, you have to answer for it. But like you mentioned, that reflection does lead to some accountability. It also leads to that truth and reconciliation that you're probably seeing in Europe, right? To the point where if you can't reflect on it eternally, then you won't be able to discuss it openly either.
Yeah.
And I get the idea that, when we have these conversations, and Eleanor, you asked a great question, by the way, and I was going to lead to that too, is when you're discussing racism with your students, what type of reaction do you get? And you did share this with me too in Vegas, and your reaction to that too. So I want to let you answer that question.
Well, actually, I'm curious, what did I share with you in Vegas? Because I want to make sure that I cover it if I'm going to answer.
It's very similar to what you said earlier today about you shouldn't be in this profession.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The reaction that we get from students is generally very positive to this. I mean, it's 90 some odd % of the time, students are actually very interested in using the model, as I call it, to continue to self-examine. When we turn the conversation specifically to conversations about race, it generally takes on a kind of I'm not really here to tell you are or are not a thing. I'm not going to tell you if you think a certain way you're racist, and if you think a different way you're not, because I don't think I'm qualified to do that. What I am going to do is I'm going to tell you that if you're willing to engage in the process of understanding yourself, you're going to have a much better career in public service. You're going to be happier. You're going to make more friends. You're going to make a difference in the world that's going to really bring a lot to you that's going to make make all that work better for you. If you haven't asked these questions, if you don't really want to, engage in this, self-reflection, that's fine. But I'm here to tell you, and the other 300 years of law enforcement experience I've got that we use in generating this curriculum, they're going to tell you as well that you're probably not going to have the 25-year career you're after. You're probably going to end up, suffering from some of those things that unfortunately we now see are really plaguing law enforcement. And that's why you cannot have this conversation these days without drawing into officer wellness. I'm here to do what I'm doing because I want my students to be happy in what they do in law enforcement, or becoming lawyers or judges or firefighters or whatever. And, when I look around, I see a lot of very unhappy people in these careers. And I don't believe that unhappiness is required. And I also don't believe that it's necessary, to deal with the community in such a way that to provoke it. There are police chiefs I've met. There is training I've seen that officers find ways of embracing community, in ways that make them feel wonderful. And if that's what we can really bring, to this conversation, for me, I guess what I'm getting at here is this: personal self-interest is a perfectly fine vehicle or lever to maneuver in getting people to think differently about other people. If someone realizes that, and this is why I think I went through my self-reflection regarding my family, is yes, you're right, Terry, that is a construct that was bad for the outside, but what was it doing to me on the inside, right? And if those pieces of that history were still there and I wasn't aware of them, that's what's making the misery. That's what's causing the issue. And I don't want to be, part of that, or I didn't want that to carry. Right. So it was really, interesting, to get back into a conversation, about, no, it can be about you. It can be about you having a happy career. But you can't do that if you don't self-reflect.
And again, I think that self-reflection piece is what is the most difficult piece to get people to understand why that's important. Like I think when I talked about again racism, and we'll stick on top of racism, and having that self-reflection question that I asked myself, and I challenge other people to ask those questions too. There's a level of guilt that always pops up too. And I think guilt is something that you just, I always say guilt could be a good thing, right? Guilt means that maybe you're empathetic, maybe, right? Maybe. But it also could mean that there's a negative connotation that you have not dealt with yourself, right? There's a part of a negativity that you haven't processed yourself, and it comes out to be guilt. Yeah. I see you had to say something about. I saw a good question from Tracy that has popped up on the screen too. And defining racism is something that I think is also important too. So, yeah, how do you define racism with your student? And again, just to be clear about when we say your students, your students are interested in pursuing careers,
right,
in the helping field, yeah,
in public service, yeah. So it's not just law enforcement, but that's the broader public service. The most direct way to answer that question, how do we define racism for our students in this class that I'm describing? The easiest way to answer that is simply say we don't. We let the students define that for themselves. And the reason we do that is because the concepts that I think we're concerned about also here, Terry, and this is what I have to make perfectly clear to everyone, that all the faculty that are teaching this class and the others within the CJ department here, this class replaces nothing. This class simply starts a conversation in a particular way that gets students oriented in having those tougher conversations in which racism needs to be defined. And that is certainly also going on in other classes. So we specifically have courses in race, class, and gender. We specifically have courses in professional development that directly deal with those definitions. But for what we're talking about here, which is the first year course, which we call the Uncommon course, The idea here is actually to let the students lead these conversations about what they feel and without those labels, so that they can talk about them openly. So that then when they get to the class in which they're learning, about race, class, and gender, they're learning about African American history, they're learning about the LGBTQ plus movement, they've broken down some of those walls and some of that defensive energy so they can hear it. And so in the Uncommon course, there are professors that I have teaching the class that are qualified, that have backgrounds in publications. Lorenzo's one. He easily could do that if he wanted to. But I've got also a lot of professors that, quite frankly, I wouldn't want them, to attempt that, and I might be one of those. I would much rather have the students talk about what they're feeling in relation to applying social value to anything about anyone that isn't decided, and process that in such a way where they're ready to then have that conversation about racism when they reach that level. But go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah. So your course is more of a pretense to a possible a deeper conversation in the future. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, exactly. In other words, we were looking for a common language that would allow the students basically allow everybody to just talk about themselves, so we could deconstruct a lot of the stuff that people bring to college when they get here. And what we found is that by framing it this way, we allowed students. Unquestionably, racism comes up. For their final presentations, they get so comfortable talking about this stuff. Sometimes for their final presentations, they'll literally say, "I want to examine in why I have this fear of African American young men." I've had students do that presentation, and they do research, and they go through these processes where they're talking about where this came from, and they talk about their grandparents, and they talk about things they heard at Thanksgiving dinner. And you sit there in the room, you're like, "Whoa, this is amazing that I'm getting students to talk about this." But that comes from them defining it, not necessarily us, telling them about it. Now, but again, I want to be clear again. I'm not saying that you don't do that in a college curriculum. You absolutely do that in a college curriculum. We're just not doing it in this class. The CJ faculty has developed a curriculum that definitely engages, within those issues and those definitions, and a lot of other issues connected to that as they move through.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about this conversation, and I got two questions, and that's what I'll have a question too. So, because it looks like you're doing sort of exploratory conversations where it's not like we're going to define racism, but instead we're going to interrogate your own self, and how you fit in those spaces. My question is, do you use history and current events in these discussions? How does those turn out?
Yeah, the process we came up with, I think, is really cool. It's something I'm actually really, really proud of. We have like, for instance, this semester we have 16 sections of this class running because we have a huge incoming class. So the 16 sections are broken up into what I call 2 pods. In each pod, there are obviously 8 sections. Well, what happens is the first few weeks, one professor is dealing with one section. But then after a few weeks, what happens is each professor has a piece that they do that relates to how you don't apply social values to things about people that they didn't decide, in a context that relates to either their personal background, their research interest, or some historical context. And then they teach that to every section in their pod. We call it the carousel. So by the time the semester is over, the students not only get the model, but they then get 8 separate examples that come from, as you say, historical perspectives, personal experience, all kinds of things that then allow the students to really explore this through what the professors are bringing. But a lot of it is historical, or many of the pieces, as we call them, do share tremendous historical context. We've had 2 police chiefs, African American police chiefs here, who have taught this class, with us for a while now. One of them has been around from the very beginning, and the other joined us last year. And they simply talk about what it was like to be an African American male growing up in their environments, and then becoming a police officer, and then becoming a police chief. And so the students sort of get this sort of process. They're hearing a story from the sort of firsthand experience after they've self-examined in relation to, how they're applying, judgment to things about people that they didn't decide. And that's where quite frankly, some of those are where we get the best sort of moving the needle, where you get the students writing reflections about, I had no idea, right, that I was applying, these thoughts in this way, or I didn't see this before, or I never knew this was there. We had one student not too long ago. It was in Dr. Dady's class, who he started the semester by talking about how racism was over, and it's been over since the Jim Crow laws were declared unconstitutional or whatever. And he was whatever. By the end of the semester, he did his entire presentation on hate crime and the importance of hate crime legislation. And I remember thinking, that's a journey. That's quite a journey to have gone through.
That's what self-interrogating oneself would do to you, though. That's exactly what happened, right? If you, and again, I say this because I get in trouble a lot, David. I think I mentioned this already. I get in trouble a lot, but whenever I look at interrogating not just biases, but just narratives, right? I think about the narratives of even slaves, runaway slaves. I think of narratives of slaveholders. I think of the narratives of policing. And again, this whole Moses People Speak, the whole catalog is narratives of, actually, David, you are the first, and this is funny, you are the first non-African-American on Moses People Speak.
Wow. Very, very I am really
you are the first. If you look at the catalog, it's all been brothers and sisters that's been sharing their stories, right? And the reason why this platform was created was because I was seeing our brothers and sisters in law enforcement being traumatized by the systems they were currently in, right? And when you see that, again, I always ask the question is, how can we take care of those folks, right? Because their mental well-being is important.
Yeah.
But also, how can we let folks know this is the way that it is, right? And I think about that's why what you're sharing about having people's narratives be shared, especially those with different cultures, right? Why that's so important for an incoming generation of, well, not just law enforcement, but anyone that's going to work with people. I think that's a good way to put it. Not just law enforcement, but you're talking about just law enforcement. You're talking about firefighters. You're talking about EMTs. You're talking about anyone that's going to have lawyers and judges. Those are right. There's a couple of questions that I think we sort of skipped over. Eleanor asked two questions. One is right now is, did students explain why he fears African American males? So I think this goes back to the student you were just talking about. Yeah.
Let me say that real quick. And Eleanor, I do not say this to dodge your question at all. First off, it was a woman, not a young man. It was a young woman. And I don't want to share her experience out of context. So I'm actually not going to answer your question, that question directly. What I am going to tell you is this, though. The students that have those types of experiences or push themselves into those kinds of realms of self-exploration, the one thing that all of them agree on was they never understood the damage that those kind of prejudices was doing to them until they self-examined. And so when this particular student went through this process, she came to this conclusion of how much she'd been missing out on, how much of her life, how many other places she might have traveled, how many other friends she might have made, how many other things might have happened. And that was for her this hugely heavy thing. And I don't want to balance it by saying that makes the fact that she was operating in this biased fashion for so long okay. It's not what I'm trying to get at all. Outward, taking responsibility means you have to act. But when she realized, again, personal self-motivation, personal self-interest, when she realized what she'd been losing, that was a very powerful motivator for her to take action, to do things differently, to make decisions differently, to actively do things differently around the groups, or, around African American males, that then begin to really change, her life in, very positive and amazing ways. And so, I don't want to, speak for anyone else's experience, but the students that we've had, they've been, moving the needle at all is what I'm after. Some students, I move it this far, and I'm just as happy when I move them this far. When I move some students this far as I am when I get, someone like that particular student who, really went all in. But at the end of the day, we've got to really kind of take advantage of where we are right now in this conversation about self-reflection across the country. If you want it to be, if you want to label it and call it DEI and that scares you, whatever. But a very brave young woman, by the way, Nakia, the woman I'm talking about, I'm still in touch with. She was a student of mine years ago, but very brave young woman, absolutely. But one of the things that I think we're missing out on is, if we want to call it DEI, but you can't get in public service, in my opinion, you can't get in public service and have a competent, happy 20-year career without self-reflecting. You can't do it. And if you're going to try, God bless you, because you're going to be miserable. And so really that's what I'm really trying to get my students to understand is we're not all going to come to the same conclusions even after we self-reflect, right? Mm-hmm. And it may, at the end of the day, may not lead to the end result, that we are all after. But I find it impossible to believe that we're not going to move. Again, some of us are going to move this far, some of us are going to move this far, And I think that's important. There's no perfect. There's only better. And as long as we're still moving, I think that's a win. Yeah.
Yeah. So I see Eleanor had to have a question, and I think it's geared towards the cadets, the academy. What type of psychological testings are they receiving? If they're receiving it at all, and I think this also goes back to what you were saying to David about the well-being of officers or health professionals, right? Do you guys in your course you talk about mental health, psychological?
Very much so. Yeah, now more than ever. And I think, but to answer Eleanor's question directly, we're not an academy, so we don't actually do any psychological. I mean, we're a university, so we do no more psychological testing or evaluating of individuals than Penn State does or anyone else does. What we do, though, is we make it very clear that there are experiential experiences. I hate experiential education is used too often. The term has just become too much.
Yes.
But the internships are great, co-ops are fantastic. But my personal thing, where I lean in very, very heavy, is the study abroad. Terry, you and I know, you take a student who's 18, 19 years old. You put them on a plane, you get them overseas for a semester. When they come back, they're not the same person. They come back a different person. And my attitude about it is I'd like to, whatever energy that is, I believe it's wrapped around not learning about the other culture. I believe it's wrapped around what you learn about yourself when you're in a foreign culture. And that's why I think when we talk about the concept of self-reflection, colleges, like, now is the time, right? This is what they're here for. This is what they're after. Part of the reason why they have these transformative experiences in foreign countries is because they're asking themselves tough questions about the experiences that they're having. It's also because, they're being brave. They're doing things that they didn't do before. They're trying new foods. They're meeting new people. They're, battering themselves through, foreign languages, whatever it is, right? But at the end of the day, if we're going to acknowledge that students come back better equipped to deal with the world after a study abroad, and we're going to acknowledge that's because of self-reflection, then why in God's name would we not want to continue that process, through the educational model as, to the nth degree and to as much as we highly can, if we know they're headed for public service. That's the end game.
And I say, you were saying that's really part of that curriculum that's offered in your college too, is that if you're going to be in that helping profession or the helping services, that here are some of the competencies you need to have before you leave in the institution. And I'm hoping that your institution is the only one that does that. Like that should just be the
Well,
the norm.
Yeah, we've had good luck with what we've done here. The engineering school and the business college have also embraced this, in that they incorporate a bit of the model into their first year courses, specifically designed. And I even have a forensic science professor here who runs the master's in forensic science, who every year when they do their seminar class, she invites me in to do a real quick down and dirty sort of truncated view of the model. But what's fascinating is the students very highly rate that as an experience that's very relevant to their work in forensic science. And a lot of people sometimes, when they think, DEI work or self-reflection, how does this relate to playing with test tubes and DNA machines? And it's like, well, you're standing next to someone else who's doing the same thing, and they may not be like you, and you have to work with them. And it's getting us all to realize that this is a process that can serve all of us if we're really dedicated and interested to self-reflect, if we're willing to ask ourselves those tougher questions.
Now, I would say that I know I'm looking at the time, and we definitely over our 45 minutes. I was going to have you on, but there was some great questions. I was going to say the lady that commented, Nakaya Jones, if you looking for a narrative of policing, that's one person right there. Nakaya Jones is one. I'll probably send her information after this show, because she was in law enforcement. She actually was one that spoke out, and her narrative is really powerful. So I'll send you her information as well.
Love to hear it.
Yeah. So here's the thing, and again, no surprise here, because I asked every guest the same question, and
okay.
David, you are no different. But I gotta say, before I ask you this question, it's really been a pleasure getting to know you over the last couple of months. So you need to come back.
Happy to come.
I think the one of the things that is interesting about this space is we do a lot of talk about racial awareness, racial justice, and so on and so on. It's a different conversation when you're asking people to self-reflect on who they are, interrogate themselves. And I think that when you have students that you're responsible for, that's really important too.
Yeah.
And so my question, as it is for every person that enters this show, is what is your message to America? And I'm going to put you on the spotlight.
Okay. My message to America: if the change we're after is nationwide, then it's going to involve all of us, which means nobody's off the hook, which means all of us need to take a deeper look at what we think and why we think the things we do surrounding the things about people that are not decided. And we need to do this not so that we can blame ourselves or blame each other for things. It's because it gives us a pathway for taking responsibility for the things that we can do in making the changes that are needed to get to the place we all want to be.
I was muted. Wow. David, it's been a pleasure. Again, first of all, our friend in common that's here, he is watching. He did comment early on today.
Okay.
So he is watching.
He
actually emailed me, said he's going to watch. So I knew he was going to be on the call. Sean's asking for an after party. But so David, for you don't know, we have the after party in which I will play the end of the show. And then if you stay on for like 5-10 minutes, if anyone have any questions, want to connect. All right. So what I'm going to do, folks, I'm going to say goodbye officially to David for Moses People Speak. And we're going to be back in about 2 minutes. Please stay on for the after party. Sean, you can put the after party thing on. All right. We'll be right back.
Tell us what you really mean, ma'am. Law enforcement officers should be role models, period. If you can't be a mentor, you shouldn't have that uniform.
I could take break from this world.
All my blinders are taken off. I can see what you guys are talking about. Y'all don't see what we're talking about yet. Policing is the law enforcement arm of systemic racism.
Be a lost girl and fly.
Well, the message for America is that they need to wake up. We need to stop the repeat. We need to stop the revolving door. And we need to come up with better ways of law enforcement. Criminal justice reform needs to reflect what it is. Ain't no way in the world somebody should be sitting in jail with a $1 bill for months.
I just wanna be free, finally.
All right, the after party. You know, so this is not scripted at all. No questions in mind. Matter of fact, David, you one of the in that commercial, one of them was Nakia Jones. She was one of the guests. Yeah, that was her. And you know, my dear sister Nakia, who's was a police officer out of Ohio, spoke out on very powerful, emotional message about the Alton Sterling shooting, actually, and how she felt as an African American woman being in law enforcement at the same time of having to wear the badge and be that community person, right? And at the same time, deal with the community itself when you have incidents like Alton Sterling. And any of those national incidents that take place, and police officers, especially black police officers, having to answer to the community for something that may have happened states. Right. We saw that recently with Tyree Nichols, right? Yeah. And I remember we didn't do a show on that, but the conversation always happens is when these incidents happening, the community would turn their attention to black officers, right, and say, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" You know. So Nakia Jones one, and again, as you saw that clip, we've have, you know, this is episode 23, so we had 22 guests on prior to you. But so this the talk about a couple of things now that this is the after party. Is what are you hoping now? I mean, I know we talked about this a little bit in Vegas, but when your students are leaving, they're graduating, they're going on to the professions, what are you hoping for them? Like, what are you hoping they take from that experience that you're giving them?
There was I don't know, we were invited guests, I guess, up to Northeastern University. This is pre-COVID, so this is about 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember there was the chief of police up there. His name is Mike Davis. And he gave us all a presentation. It was myself, and it was Ron L. Higgins, and it was Chief Campbell, and it was John DiCarlo, who's a police chief here, who's also on faculty in the CJ department. And I think Lorenzo was with us as well. And we went up to this presentation, and what he had described was the police department that I want to work for. I mean, what he described was this, you know, every moment you're in public space is an opportunity to connect with the community. Every moment someone walks up and says, "Excuse me, do you know where, you know, such and such street is?" It's an opportunity for you to make a connection with the community. And he was leaning in on this to such a degree that we were like waiting for the other shoe to drop. And you know, his entire point of it was, you know, we don't have to be miserable. You know, to a certain extent, you know, we're doing what we can to make ourselves miserable by not taking advantage of things, because we're, you know, someone tells us about officer safety, and, you know, well, I can't approach that person that way. I have to approach this way with my gun drawn to do this. And, you know, Chief Davis was like, no, you can still preserve officer safety without being a dick, you know, without,
right.
You can still make the connection. And
right.
I think really what he was getting at, he didn't talk about this, but it's certainly what I took away from it, was that people are using a lot of cops, and again, I use a lot, but I'm not saying all. I'm saying that there are a lot of officers out there that are trying to do the job well. I think they're just stuck in a culture that makes that difficult. And what I took away from it is there's a lot of officers that are using these things they're trained to do because they don't want to do the community engagement. They don't want to do it. And part of the reason they don't want to do it is because they don't want to have to do it, because they don't, maybe they don't want to talk to a person like that.
Right.
Or I don't want to deal with someone who's mentally ill, or I don't want to deal with someone who comes from a different culture. So I've got these things I learned in the academy that I can use officer safety, and I can use this and I can use that, to prevent me from having to engage. And that's what tripped my wire on self-reflection. Because it was like, if you're honestly been on the job as long as some of these officers had, and you've never asked yourself that question, I'm walking up to somebody who's of a fill in the blank culture. It doesn't matter what it is.
Right.
I feel that, right? I feel that weird, right? Well, if I've never self-reflected as to where that is and where that came from and what that's all about, and my occupation has given me all of these things I can use as barriers to having to address that, right? Or reasons why I don't have to address that. Yeah, thank you. Fear, right?
Yeah.
If I don't have to do that, then not only am I going to do the job, be rewarded for doing the job, but then also never have to, go down the road. I never have to self-reflect. I never have to.
Right.
And that's part of, and again, I'm being a little arrogant here by making this leap, but I don't think it's such a leap. I think that's part of what makes the negativity in the policing culture turn into the alcoholism, the domestic violence, the suicide.
Right. That's another topic too that we haven't even discussed too. Yeah.
I mean, you cannot do a job for 8 hours a day for 40 hours a week, or whatever, 60 with overtime, whatever it is, right? You can't do that and not be yourself in that period of time, and then go home and try to be yourself without creating schizophrenia. Like you are going to drive yourself literally crazy. And so we've got to find a way to get people to discover who they are, to like who they are, and to want to be that person with the community they serve. And if they're not part of that community, then they've got to know how to bridge that distance. And that's not going to come from a police manual.
Right.
Go ahead.
I'm looking at Eleanor's question too, and this is a question that I took on a different meeting over the last couple of months too, and I say this because the Tyre Nichols situation, right? I think that some people, I'm not one of them, but some people were shocked that there were 5 Black officers that did this, and I go back to asking that question. I'm like, because they're Black officers doesn't mean they have Black consciousness, right? And so, and again, that's another way of saying they have to interrogate themselves. Maybe say, why do I feel in my community I have to be a certain way? I don't think that's by the race, but Eleanor was asking the question is about, and I think it came out too. Fear is one of those reasons. Is why do you think it is, and why is it handled differently? But I think Eleanor was asking for some elaboration on sort of like the police brutality, and we're looking at that racial statistics here.
Yeah, no, I know those statistics well, Eleanor, and I agree with you that the data is clear. There's no argument there whatsoever about the reality. You're asking me, why do I think that is? That's unfortunately not part of the expertise I have. I feel, though, from my personal experience and from where I find myself as an educator in looking at how students have reacted to the curriculum I've developed, as well as the work I did down at the Wiesenthal Center. And again, I say this, I qualify all of that because I don't want anybody thinking I'm an expert in this. I'm not. I've not written papers on police use of force. I do not, this is not my expertise. But my experience in doing what I've done informs me that, and I think this relates very well to the Tyre Nichols incident. I think the reason it is because the structure, the legacy of slavery created a structure that we never flipping tore down. I mean, this is the thing about the Holocaust, which is why I keep leaning back to between the Germans and the Poles. When they finally came together, which, by the way, was much later in history than any of you than we imagined. It was literally the first time that they got together and talked about this. It was like 2015. Okay,
Wow.
I mean, it's nuts, right? You know, for us, it's much longer. But I mean, it's like, what the hell, right? But at the end of the day, they had to dismantle systems of thought that allowed police officers to go into other countries and shoot other police officers, right? That's what they had to dismantle, right? And we haven't even admitted that the structure is still there. Like we haven't even
Right.
right. We passed a few laws. We're good now. I mean, literally, that's what they're thinking. And
Right.
And so
Right.
to me, my answer to that, Eleanor, would be, and again, not an expert. I'm not, don't throw this up on social media. I'm not claiming to have an answer here. But if you're asking me what my opinion is based on what I've seen in teaching this and what I saw down in New York and what I've seen in comparison to my experience in Europe, I just have to acknowledge, we haven't addressed the issue. We have not done what other nations have done. And until we do, I don't see the culture really, seeing the value in embracing the change at that level. And well, Eleanor, you say nothing's changed. One of the things that happened, Terry, when other people here found out about my working on the King case way back when I first arrived here. And I remember we were, talking about it, this, and that we could do this, we could do that, we could have a special thing or special talk, whatever. And I was meeting with some other people here who do a lot of work in policing and race and whatever. And they said, yeah, why don't we do a thing? And Schroeder can talk about King, and then we can talk about all the things we've learned since King up to today. And then we all stood there and looked at each other. We went, what have we learned? I mean, everyone in the room was just like, that'll be a short conversation. Like what? We haven't learned anything, Yeah. I mean, you have to laugh.
Well, you gotta laugh or you gotta cry. That's what I always say. You gotta laugh, you gotta cry. But that's a good point, and that's a, and I see there's great questions here from our friend Howie.
There he is. Hi, Howie.
Hey, Howie. So there was a couple of years back. So Moses P. Cobb, as you can see, the plaques is above our head. Samuel J. Battle, Moses P. Cobb. So Samuel J. Battle was the first Black NYPD officer, and lieutenant and sergeant, my great uncle, and he told his story, his narratives about 110 years ago, and so I started asking the question, what has changed in 110 years? Because he was very open about his narrative, and when I put that question out there were police officers sharing their narratives that were very similar to what he described back in 1911. Yeah, and that's what was eye-opening to me when we were talking about the importance of these narratives and why we have to keep them going, because there hasn't been change in those areas that need to be actually changed. Now, I don't know that this was news that was shared with me earlier today too by another member of SOJ, that in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania State Police announced yesterday that they're completely removing their minimum college credit requirement for cadets. So that's why Howie proposed that question: is how do we encourage law enforcement to be more selective when hiring, because they are facing this again. It's not the job that people are applying for much these days. I served on a couple of police interviews this summer, and the chief was telling me, 10 years ago, he would have like hundreds of applications, and you really get like 30 these days. And so they're lowering the standards and what have you not. So how do we address that?
Well, what I'm going to give you, again, these are just thoughts from my experience. I don't claim to be an expert on this. I don't know anything about, police unions or police hiring or, through that process beyond what I've learned here in this capacity as an associate dean. But I will tell you this. One of the most powerful things that Mike said, Chief Davis said when we were up at Northeastern, is he was talking about speaking to a group of police chiefs. And after he explained his plan for officer wellness and explained how his officers are generally much happier than those in other police departments, and how people want to come work at Northeastern because they're hearing about how this environment is just so much more supportive. Some chief in the back raised his hand and said something like, "Yeah, okay, that's fine, but I've just got a morale problem. How do I deal with that?" To which Chief Davis kind of reeled back and said, "Really? A morale problem? How's yours?" And to me, what he was trying to say, or what I heard, maybe he wasn't trying to say this, but what I heard was, we have to start rethinking what's going on in these environments from the top down.
Yes.
We can't keep sending people into an environment that has a horrible way of treating human beings.
Yeah.
And then expect I don't know what an inoculation is for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Terry, we talked about this in Vegas. One of the reasons why I developed this curriculum for my campus is because we want to attract more students of color here. We want to attract more students who are neurodivergent. We want to attract more students, from LGBTQ plus community, from
Right.
we really love that diversity. The problem is that if they get here,
That's
and
exactly right.
the faculty are great and the staff is great, but the other students are treating them like crap, what kind of college experience is that, right?
Right.
So
Right.
the first thing we've got to do is we've got to stop looking at what we're requiring of those we're putting into policing. We have to start asking ourselves, what are we willing to give them to then be the cops we want them to be? And
Mm-hmm.
we have to start looking to the environments, actually looking into the police, environments, and putting pressure, whatever pressure we can, as outsiders, on the elements that create the heat and the anger and the tension, within, those police departments.
Right.
I don't know if you heard about this, Terry, and I have no idea how this plays out. Like I said, I'm not an expert. I don't care to understand the whole dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
What I do understand is that the Yale PD here, Women Week was last week, and the police union was passing out to incoming first-year students this sheet of paper that was about City of Fear, good luck if you survive, you can't go out to work, and the police union is passing this out. There's a skull on it with a skull and a death hood on it, and you're looking at it going, what are you doing? Right?
Wow.
Somehow in the negotiations, somebody in a policing role, a leadership role, thought that was a good idea. And you're looking at that and you're thinking, okay, now, if I'm a young person growing up and I'm getting an education, I live in Greater New Haven, and I find out that this is what's going on, that's a career I'm going to jump right in. It's like nobody seems to be thinking about the future. Everybody's just thinking about themselves.
Wow.
And so for me, I just feel like, we as a society, there are ways we can put pressure on entities, and I saw she just commented, which is, there's good law enforcement out there, right? When we found it, we need to lean into it.
Yeah, I've been saying that.
Exactly.
When we get that, when we get the law and the police or the law enforcement that we ask for, then we got to establish solid supports, right? Yeah. And I say that because, again, you look at the catalog of Moses People Speak, you would see the officers that we want to be in our communities, but they're on our show for a reason, right? Because of something that they experience, and I always define community well-being is not just what law enforcement do in the community, but also what the community do in law enforcement and with law enforcement.
I think Nakia said it earlier. A police officer who's part of the community, and the community believes that police officer is part of them. That is the most powerful thing in the world in dealing with crime and social order. That is, there's nothing more powerful than that.
Yeah.
And if we know that, right, we have that, right? So why don't we lean into that, or why don't we keep building that? The other thing I will say though is this, and I had this conversation with a lot of people around here. I believe the concern we should be primarily focused on in thinking about who should be or shouldn't be a police officer actually revolves around the concept of intransigency. I believe very strongly that if you've got an open mind, it means you're willing to learn.
Yeah.
If you're willing to learn, then when you're faced with that thing, right, you're out on the street, your badge is on your chest, your camera's on your chest, you've got the person there. Am I going to use this as a moment to try to engage in my community? Or am I going to use all the things I was taught to keep me from having to do that, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you're open-minded, if you like learning, if you like growth, if those are things that you're interested in, there's a greater likelihood that you're probably going to engage. Right. And I think that, therefore, when we talk about what are we going to train officers to do, what should we be looking for? Lately I want to put intransigency as the biggest red flag, right? Mm-hmm. If someone comes in, I know how to do this, and I'm training, and I'll never violate the rules, and I've got all this, down. That's all great, but when it comes time to use discretion, are you really going to be open-minded in in that process?
Right.
Because that's really what we're talking about.
Right.
If I know what kind of father you are, if I know what kind of husband you are, if I know what kind of wife you are, what kind of girlfriend you are, what kind of aunt and uncle you are, there's a pretty good chance I need to worry about less what kind of police officer you're going to be.
Mm-hmm. Humanizing. Yeah, that's the humanizing effect. Yeah.
Nobody gets a pass, but I'm saying there are some indicators there, that, and a lot of what's going on today is trying to remove that from the interview process or the hiring process, and to move to something automated or something that's more like a checklist. You can't checklist this.
No, and I will say I was this past summer, like I said, I was asked to sit in some police interviews and provide feedback on the candidates, and I thought, to me, when I was doing these police interviews, I was like, here's an opportunity for me to really provide these type of feedback to say, hey, here's who we want to see in our community. The other part to this too is the recruitment, right? And I think I can't remember what episode it was, but it was one of the early episodes where we had some folks on from the movie The Killing of Kenneth Chamberlain. Really great movie, by the way. And the director said to me, was like, if you go to YouTube and you look up police recruitment video, you will see two different types of recruitment videos, right? One of them is like GTA, that's busting down the doors, the guns are blazing, and the other one was like serving ice cream and cotton candy, like be a part of your community, right? And so I had my cousin, she's in college, and she was writing a paper on policing, so she reached out to me. So I shared this information with her, and I said, you want to do a deeper dive into this, you can start looking at the geography of these areas. So you can see the police recruitment video, look up police department, and then look up the statistics in that area of, breakdown statistics of, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status is a big one, the poor communities are the ones that typically got and I think that is something that we need to also be mindful of as the folks that we try to recruit. But you know what, David, we are past the 15 minutes.
Yeah, I gotta go.
And I gotta go too. But I again, there's a lot of folks on here to ask some good questions. There's some great chat. A lot of folks will thank you for being a part of this. And so again, we will connect soon. And it's been a pleasure, David. So to everybody else, I want to say thank you, Sean, for dropping the killing of Kenneth Chamberlain in the chat. I want to say everyone have a good night. And David, again, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Talk to you soon.